Variety Radio Hour. I'm your host, James Goings, joined once again with co-host
Matthew Davids.
All right, let's go ahead and get started with the news from this past week. The biggest piece of news that I'm sure some people who aren't even necessarily gamers have heard about is that it is the 20th anniversary of Pokemon. And Pokemon has announced their new duo of games, having exhausted their supply of colors, letters, precious gems, and ores. They're now turning for their source of inspiration to celestial bodies with Pokemon Sun and Pokemon Moon.
Which likely followed up shortly by Pluto and Mercury.
No, because you've got to have the director's cut. What do you think would be the third director's cut for this game?
Pokemon Earth.
Pokemon Earth, Terra Nova. So it's the 20th anniversary of having released Red and Green in Japan. And yesterday, actually, on the 3DS Nintendo eShop, were released Pokemon Red, Blue, and Yellow, which are modernized in that they are the exact same game, but they are fully compatible with the Pokemon Bank technology. And what that is in the past, you were not able to transfer your Pokemon from the Game Boy games that were Red and Blue and what were the other two? Gold and Silver and Crystal. You were not able to transfer those to DS-era games. The Game Boy Advance cartridges, they were compatible with the original Nintendo DS, so you were able to transfer those Pokemon to the DS-era games and DS-era games to 3DS, but never the original Game Boy games, which were Red and Green and Gold and Silver and Crystal. So the fact that these new games that they're re-releasing on the 3DS are available and compatible with the Pokemon Bank, that is a service that allows you to, even just on one device, to be able to transfer Pokemon. That is a huge step forward because, I mean, who doesn't want their Pikachu that was their starter Pokemon in Yellow to battle alongside their new starter Pokemon in X and Y or other games?
Which was your first Pokemon game, James?
I jumped in with Gen 4. Pokemon Diamond specifically was my very first Pokemon game. It was my very first DS game as well. And I will always stand by the fact that it wasn't always the most popular choice, but when I got to raise my Piplup into an Empoleon, that was a great achievement for me. What about you, Matthew?
My first one was Pokemon Leaf Green. I don't remember when it was, but it was a very long time ago now. But I still love the hell out of that game. I remember the sheer joy that I got out of beating the Elite Four over and over and over and over again, some 30, 40 times.
What was your starter Pokemon in that?
Charmeleon?
Charmander, first evolution. Charmelon or Charmeleon, second evolution, and then you've got your Charizard.
All I remember is that I named my Charizard after my brother, Josh, and he sort of saw me through the entire thing. The only rough part was the rock gym, because turns out fire does not beat rock. That was problematic because I only had one Pokemon over level 10.
Interesting that you would name your brother you name a Pokemon after your brother, and not because you can name your rival in that game. Who did you name your rival, or did you just choose one of the presets?
I believe I stuck with the default in that game.
Okay.
Did you ever go back and play any of the earlier games?
I owned Fire Red and Leaf Green, and because I was really into Pokemon for a while, so I used the ability to transfer your Pokemon from the Game Boy Advance game. So I actually owned all the Game Boy Advance, but I started with Pokemon Diamond. All right, moving on to our next piece of news. Naughty Dog just released a new trailer for what is supposedly going to be the final entry in their Uncharted series, Uncharted 4: Thief's End, only to then re-release said trailer because after one, I'm probably going to pronounce this name correctly. Aziza Aymar, who is the head of content for Assassin's Creed, discovered in this trailer that there was a painting in this trailer, as in-game, in, I believe, Nathan Drake's home or apartment, he has a painting that looks exactly and basically is merely photoshopped, but still a piece of concept art for Assassin's Creed 4 Black Flag.
The actual only difference was that they photoshopped out the main protagonist from Black Flag. Everything else in the image was entirely the same. They just took out the main character and said, hey, it'll be fine.
Yep. And whether this, well, I'm assuming it wasn't intentional, because what Naughty Dog did was, first of all, they changed the trailer and then re-released the trailer so that it no longer has that sort of infringement. And then they released a statement, and this is Naughty Dog. We hold all artistry in high regard and take full responsibility for having allowed this to happen. We want to sincerely apologize to everyone at Ubisoft, the Assassin's Creed team, the original artist, and our fans. That was a statement by Naughty Dog in relation to this having happened.
What's really great about all this is that a lot of the response from fans and just general people wandering on the internet has been that they really liked seeing that there was some art from Assassin's Creed. The two franchises are reasonably similar in that, well, both of them you play as a protagonist who can climb extremely difficult cliffs and buildings. It's loosely story-based. There's lots of killing, lots of action, lots of exploration, and extremely interesting open worlds. So people actually really enjoyed that when they found out that it seemed like they put an Easter egg into the trailer for people to find.
Until Naughty Dog changed it and apologized, I assumed that, and well, I also saw this tweet on Twitter. When I saw it, and then heard that this is indeed a piece of concept art from Assassin's Creed, I assumed that it was an Easter egg, simply because, you pointed that out, they are very similar, and I personally hold both franchises in pretty high regard. Black Flag especially, I had a fun time, sailing the seven seas with Mr. Kenway.
Once again, copyright gets in the way of a little bit of good fun.
Well, gosh darn it. Please don't go out there, listeners, and infringe on copyrighted material just because we said it was fun. Please do not misinterpret.
It can be fun. It can also end up being very poor.
Yep. We here at the Gaming Society Radio Hour, please don't think that we endorse this.
This is an official statement that we do not endorse copyright infringement.
All right. Before the CIA and FBI burst in on us while we're recording, let's move on to our final news segment. And that, ladies and gentlemen and listeners alike, is that, guess what? Capcom, who has been releasing HD remakes for their Resident Evil games, is going to be releasing more HD remakes for their games, but this time they've announced that the games that are receiving this HD treatment are Resident Evil 4, 5, and 6 are getting HD remakes. I'm not the only one who finds this an interesting move, am I, Matthew? I mean, 6 is barely over 3 years old.
Well, that's true, but again, first off, Resident Evil has been an extremely popular franchise. The original games were extremely popular, essentially culminating with Resident Evil 4, which was the most critically acclaimed game, and still today, many people will go back and play it because it's actually just that good. And Resident Evil 5, again, while it was more of an action game than a horror game and lacked a lot of those aspects from the original games, it was still a good game in its own right. It was about 6 that things started to go downhill, and they attempted to follow the episodic trend, actually, with Resident Evil Revelations. which again sort of didn't really fit the format very well. But the reason that they're doing it, it's very clear actually. Money.
Well, okay. I mean, it's not just that necessarily. I mean, they released the very first Resident Evil game. They re-released that, and they remade it from the ground up with a new engine, updated models and textures and all that, lighting and what have you. And people were crazy about that because it was clear that a lot of effort was going into it because they were remaking it from the ground up and because it is a classic. They remade, I should say, and then proceeded to re-release Resident Evil 0, which is the same deal. They're working on Resident Evil 2, which I believe hasn't received any sort of remake throughout the years. And while it's not necessarily it's not up on as high of a pedestal as the very first Resident Evil, it's still seen as being a good game. And I understand wanting to remake Resident Evil 4 because people view that as a classic. 5, while not necessarily being quite as in tune with the spirit of what Resident Evil is also a good game. And Resident Evil 6 was pretty much panned. And I guess if we're going to make a quick tangential argument into the quality of the Resident Evil games, I think a lot of what is plaguing the series at this point in time, the reason that people who are a big fan of the series are hesitant to label them as being good games because they're not necessarily as very Resident Evil. I hear this argument a lot with the new Star Trek movies that they are good movies in their own right, but are they good Star Trek movies? Are they really able to keep with the theme and spirit for what a Star Trek movie should be? And I think Resident Evil is having the same problem. Do we want this big action blockbuster that 5 and 6 were, or do we want a more grounded survival horror experience? More like in Resident Evil 1 and in 4. I think there's sort of this division in the fan base.
I mean, I think you're absolutely right. But what I will say is that the price point that Capcom is asking for is $20 per game, which when it comes down to Resident Evil 4 and Resident Evil 5, those are really quite good prices, actually, if they're going to be sort of these polished, essentially new games that just people know for a fact are going to be good. Resident Evil 6 is going to be a harder sell, but it always was a hard sell. That kind of was the problem in the first place.
Yep. And they are releasing these in reverse order that they originally came out. Resident Evil 6 is coming, the remake, retextured HD is coming out March 29th. Resident Evil 5 is coming out this summer, and then Resident Evil 4, which is, I mean, if we're being honest, probably the one that people are excited about.
They can say it's the only one I'm really excited about personally.
That's coming out in the fall, just in time for holiday 2016. So, with that concludes the news segment of this show. Matt and I are going to take a break, but while we leave you, we are going to be playing our Song of the Week. And what we have for you this week is a song. It's from the horror game Until Dawn. The song is "Oh Death" by Amy Van Rokel. This is McAllister Radio, WMCM, and we'll leave you with that. And we're back. This is the Gaming Society Radio Hour. I'm your host, James Goings, joined today with my recurring guest host,
Matthew Davids.
All right. So now we're going to move on to our feature, and we're going to talk about the pros and cons of episodic gaming. Matt, let's start. What was the very first episodic game you played, and what was your appraisal of it? What did you think of it?
The first episodic game I ever played was Life is Strange. It is actually to date the only episodic game that I have ever played. But what I can say is that I found it to be an absolutely phenomenal game. Just everything about it. The story was engaging. The twists were impressive and incredible. It felt like the characters I really enjoyed sort of kept having a presence and even gained a presence throughout the series. I have nothing but praise for it.
All right. I actually haven't played that yet. That is on my list. It's a very long list of games that I'm supposed to play. My very first game, episodic game that I played was The Walking Dead of Telltale fame, which is really what put Telltale on the map as more of a mainstream studio, because they'd done some work. They made Jurassic Park before that, some stuff with CSI, Sam and Max, but they're really breakthrough effort in terms of the licensing of what they were making. It was their biggest name that they'd worked with to date, but then also just quality as well. I mean, the Spike VGA Awards, it won Game of the Year, and well, I don't necessarily think I would have called it my Game of the Year when it came out. It was a very quality game, but more and more there have been episodic games coming, and I don't want to use the term invading because I don't necessarily think it's a negative thing, but coming in and taking up space on what a lot of mainstream games are, because Life is Strange has come out. Telltale has expanded the licensed content that they're working with. Since then we've had Wolf Among Us, we've had another Walking Dead, we have Game of Thrones, Tales from Borderlands, a lot of stuff Telltale is doing. But now there's some studios and franchises that have never been episodic that are announcing that their newest entries are going to follow the episodic formula, namely Final Fantasy VII, the remake that people have been very excited about for a long time to be coming out, has announced that it's going to be episodic, which there's been quite a bit of backlash, because not only has there never been a Final Fantasy game that is episodic, never a core entry to the Final Fantasy series that has been episodic. This is a remake, and the original Final Fantasy VII was not episodic. The other big franchise that's throwing its hat in the episodic ring is Hitman, the new Hitman game. And that's a little sketchier in terms of what is an episodic game. Does it strictly have to, is it just a game that follows the episodic release schedule, or is there something in terms of story that also makes a game episodic? I guess this is a newer genre of game. With the advent of being able to download your games and not have them on discs, it's been able to expand. But Hitman. And I imagine that the way that they're going to do that, most episodic games that are story-based, you have a self-contained story arc in addition to an arc that runs through the whole season. I don't know what they're going to do with the Hitman games, because it doesn't necessarily, in my opinion, I feel, from past efforts, lend itself to the episodic formula. So I'm a little more leery about that. Well, I guess I'm kind of leery about Final Fantasy VII being episodic as well.
I think the first thing we should probably do is define exactly what an episodic game is. The first episodic games were probably the Telltale games in general, with Sam and Max, all that sort of thing. But really, I'd say the first popular episodic game would have been Half-Life 2. Actually, yes, which actually came out with Half-Life 2 Part 1, and then later with Half-Life 2 Part 2, and then soon, eventually, we'll have Part 3 at some time in the future. So just for those of you out there who don't know what an episodic game is, essentially what happens is the developers will create some type of a product which is about a 2-hour game. Telltale usually aims for about 2.5 hours, and so they'll release one episode, which is sort of like a mini series if it were a movie or if it were a TV series. And so they release one episode, they'll wait about 4 to 6 weeks, or at least that's what they say. They'll wait about 4 to 6 weeks, they'll release episode 2, 4 to 6 weeks, they'll release episode 3, and on and on and on until finally they finish the series and then they put out all of the games in some type of a pass, like a season pass type of a thing. So more or less, if you are trying to play all of them the way that they come out, you're waiting 4 to 6 weeks before getting any type of resolution for what happened in the previous episode.
Right. And maybe before moving forward, Matt, in talking with you outside of this show, it seems as though we both have we definitely have differing opinions on whether or not episodic games are a good idea. So maybe we should define our platforms.
You want to do opening arguments?
No, we are sufficiently immersed into the topic at hand. Let's just define our platforms. My opinion of episodic games is I cannot think of a scenario in which I would want to play part of a game and then wait months for the next part of the game to come out. To me, that is not what a video game is. I want to be able to sit down and, if I want to, just sort of play through the experience and not have to wait for another release schedule, another release date. And if the ideal way to experience games, and by extension episodic games, is to own it all at once / play it all at once, then where does that leave episodic games? So that is where I am coming from going into this feature.
Before I go into my point, I've just got a question for you, James. Have you ever played a demo of a game that you really liked?
Yes. It was sort of a bit of a bait and switch because the demo for BioShock 2 was phenomenal. The game itself didn't necessarily have the best payoff, but I played through the demo for BioShock 2 and I was hooked.
So what would you say if I said that sort of these first episodes of these games were more or less demos, and that each game was essentially giving people a taste of what could potentially come next?
That's fair. What I would argue with that, though, is that demos are free. So the test of whether or not you want to invest your time, energy, and money into this work of art, the entrance fee for a demo is free, whereas you're already kind of selling off your soul and time and effort and money to an extent with the very first episode of a game, because you are at that point buying into it. That concept, that idea, that work of art.
I mean, that's certainly true. I would just say that the barrier for entry at $5 for an episode is significantly lower than, let's say you had a game, let's call it a Call of Duty game, $60 on release, turns out the game is absolutely terrible. Let's call it Call of Duty Ghosts. And so you buy that game on release, and it's terrible, and you hate everything about it, but you just paid $60 for that game. However, if you were, say, to purchase the first episode of a Telltale game, that's $5. Maybe you didn't like it, but you only wasted $5, and you really do now understand whether or not you'll like the rest of the series. So, as by now you probably realize that I am sort of on the episodic games.
You are embodying the pros, as it were, the pros of episodic games?
That is definitely possible. So far, what I've seen out of the games is that they are good for, as far as I can tell, absolutely everyone. There are some cases where they are less good, but in all cases, they seem to help everyone. And I'm going to just start to enumerate that essentially. So first off, it helps out the developers, because if you are a small developer, you only have to produce a small amount of content, and then you can get some revenue back before continuing on to create episode 2, get back some more money, and then be able to continue through that. And so you don't have this process where you work on a game for 4 years, and then you release the game, and it turns out people actually don't like it very much, and then it's sort of over. You've just bankrupted your company because nobody actually liked the game. However, if you were to, say, release episode 1, and then people bought it and then said, well, it's not that good, you could say, oh, okay, cool, but why isn't it all that good? And then you can use that feedback to create a better episode 2, and then create a better episode 3 off of even more feedback. So I'd say it definitely helps with the users, having the users create games rather than being sort of passively in the background.
Mm-hmm. And I understand. That from a development standpoint, episodic games make total sense. I'm not going to argue you there. That's a bit of a no contest. But I'm coming from the perspective of a lot of times the follow through, the actual execution of episodic games, and that formula has had. Yeah, it's had just such poor execution that a lot of the times the audience for these games has felt very jaded. So I'm of the opinion that, yeah, maybe it's not necessarily a bad thing, but a lot can be done to make it better, because right now I feel as though execution for episodic games and the episodic formula has been left wanting quite a bit.
What James is referring to is that while Telltale states that the next episode will come out 4 to 6 weeks afterwards, that almost never is the case. And as a matter of fact, The Wolf Among Us, I think episode 4, episode 2, I can't remember. It came out 17 weeks after the previous episode, which is horrible. There was a twist ending that happened to the last episode, and the people were left at a cliffhanger for 17 months, and that just sort of had a lot of people...
17 weeks.
Sorry, 17 weeks. It had a lot of people... 17 months would be a lot worse. Had a lot of people sort of just leaving the franchise because it wasn't worth it after waiting all that time when they had been left hanging. And so, I'm going to talk about why it's actually okay. In a way, I would say that while in a perfect universe, developers would give out their schedule, they would stick to it rigidly, and it would be approximately 4 to 6 weeks. Unfortunately, that's not really always the case through some issues that they often have. However, what a lot of people will do when a Telltale game comes out is they just won't buy it on release. They'll wait until all the episodes are there, and then they'll just play all of them. Yes, it'll mean that they have to wait a couple years probably before all the episodes are out, or since since they heard about the game for when all the episodes come out. But that's the normal cycle. It's usually about 2 or 3 years before a game comes out after it's been announced, and so it's the same general principle. The only difference is you could theoretically play it earlier if you so chose. So now you have the choice to potentially shape the game by giving your feedback to Telltale. But you don't have to. You can just sort of buy the game after it's come out.
Yeah, that's a bit of a dangerous mentality, in my opinion, though, because what you're saying is, I mean, or maybe this isn't necessarily what you're saying, but if people look at episodic gaming, that you really should just wait until it's been all released to buy into it, then what is the positive for having that? What is the positive for having them release it episodically if the vast majority of consumers are going to wait anyway? Then that's detrimental, and you really should just be releasing it all at once. What I mean by that is that episodic games and that formula, it needs to be able to stand up on its 2 feet. It needs to be able to say, or it needs to be able to have some pros and have a reason to be episodic, other than from a development standpoint. Let's compare.
Just before that, you're stating that the vast majority of people will only play it once all of it has come out, which is not true. The fact that episodic games still exist is essentially proof positive that some people do enjoy playing it when it comes out rather than playing it once all of it has come out.
Right, but you need to be able to convince people that that is the correct way to play this game. It needs to be able to stand up on its own 2 feet and yeah, just convince people that this is the right way to play our game. Let me kind of explain this in the idea of a TV show. Okay, when you come up with an idea for an original piece, whether it's film or whether it's TV, you usually create it in the medium that it is best suited for. Okay? Why is it that the Walking Dead Telltale game is best played as an episodic game and not all at once? Why is it that The Wolf Among Us or Tales from Borderlands is better off as an episodic game in terms of the quality of the art that is being produced? Is it better off as an episodic game? Not in terms of development. I'm talking in terms of artistic integrity. Episodic games, to me, have yet to warrant, from an artistic standpoint, that there are stories that are better off told in episodic format, that the execution and the delivery of these ideas is better off in an episodic format. Because a lot of these games that we're playing after they've come out. Because for years and years and years, that's how video games have been played. That's the idea was that's how video games are meant to be played. This is a newer format, and I think that it is yet to be used to its full potential in terms of warranting the game is best played this way. And I've yet to see that in an episodic game.
Okay, I would just shy away from saying the way that the game is meant to be played, because one of the beautiful things about video games is that you don't have to play it any specific way. You have your own choices, you have your own decisions, and specifically in these games, the development cycle that's being used is so that your choices can have more of an impact later on in the game, and even more that the users who have opinions on characters that perhaps they want to see more time, they can have more time later. And so the idea that the game is meant to be played one way, I just have always hated that mentality, especially when it comes to episodic gaming, because all of these episodic games are so heavily choice-based. I mean, most of them are essentially nothing but walking simulators with choices. And these choices somehow lead to consequences down the line. And those consequences are the beautiful thing when you see something in the game and you go, oh my goodness, because I made that choice, that character died. That's amazing. I had some sort of power over this story and I somehow did something for that. So I'd say that
narratives like that, though, that are choice-based, that are, they essentially embody the idea of the butterfly effect, right? Where small choices early on can impact later ones, impact later ones. They compound. Have been told in formats that are not episodic. A great example of this is the game we just played a song from is Until Dawn. And it's made very similarly to the way that an episodic game, or I guess, let me rescind that, it is executed, the story is very similarly to the way that an episodic game would be. The premise of Until Dawn is it's sort of, it plays out like a horror movie where we follow these teenagers over the course of one night. And I believe there's 10 chapters, which are very similar to episodes. And each chapter is 1 hour of these teenagers' lives over the course of the night. And you play distinct chapters. It even goes so far as each time you start a new chapter, it recaps, just like if this were airing on TV, the events of episodes or chapters previous. And it has the idea of the branching narrative, the idea of the butterfly effect ingrained in it, and it is a walking simulator. The gameplay, the lion's share of gameplay, is relayed through decisions and QTEs, much like a Telltale game.
Quick time events, by the way.
Yes.
You press a button when it pops up on the screen.
Yes. Much in the same way that a Telltale game would be, but it was marketed and executed and shipped and distributed and made not as an episodic game, as, I guess, a normal game. Just in terms of, it's physical release or downloadable, but you don't buy individual episodes, you buy the game. And I feel as though it greatly helps the pacing and the energy. And what I mean by that is let's compare for a sec the TV show Game of Thrones and the video game Telltale Games Game of Thrones. Going in to the TV show, I have no reservations about being invested in this TV show, in the sense that I know exactly when it's going to air and when every subsequent episode is going to air. I always know that the next episode is only 1 week away. In comparison to Telltale Games Game of Thrones. The very first episode came out in December of 2014. So the very first episode came out in December. The next in February, then March, then May, July, November. There is little to no rhyme or reason. We were told that when the episodes are going to be delayed, we were told that they were going to be delayed, but we were never told until a week or even days before the new one would come out. There's been a huge problem with communication between developers and the consumers with episodic games in terms of, okay, when are we going to get our next fix? Because I think it's very fair to compare these to the way that TV shows are run, because they're using the exact same formula in terms of, these games are called episodes. Or the episodes, they're called episodes. The games are called seasons. They are borrowing the formula that TV shows have run on for, decades. But the execution has been very poor and the communication has been very poor, because we know going into a TV show that the next episode is only a week away or whatever. We don't have to be leery of, okay, so I'm interested in starting this Game of Thrones game that Telltale has made, but I don't know if I want to, because I don't know when the next episode is coming out. And if, let's say, there's a bad episode, just in terms of quality, this entire game as a whole, retrospectively, might be really good. But let's say there's a really bad episode, and I'm playing these episodes as they come out. If this episode leaves a bad taste in my mouth, and the next episode isn't months away, or I don't even know when the next episode is coming out, am I still going to be invested enough, am I still going to be interested enough to continue on with this series if the last taste I have in my mouth is a bad one, and I don't even know when I'm going to get a new sample again?
All right, I've got a lot of things to argue about. Here we go. All right. So, first off, the word episode literally just means an event or group of events that occurs as a part of a larger sequence. That's from Merriam-Webster. So, using the word episode has nothing to do with TV. And as a matter of fact, comparing video games to TV is just harmful to video games.
But it's an episodic game.
Hold on, just one moment. Comparing it to TV shows is absolutely ludicrous, because a TV series goes down one very, very linear path. When you create a video game, the entire point is that it doesn't go down a linear path. You have multiple branching options, and so the idea of going down a single path is ludicrous. It's so much harder to create that. Not only that, but development cycles in terms of this. And I know we weren't going to talk about development, but you brought up the development cycle, so I got to talk about it now. The development cycle is you create one product, you work on it, you do QA on it, which is quality assurance, you make sure that there are no bugs in it, which, by the way, is another good thing about episodic games. Since they do quality assurance after every single episode, it means that it's less likely to have game-breaking bugs. And so then you can produce one episode, you see how everybody liked it, then you can begin writing the next episode and potentially work on it. So it will almost always have delays, and that's just sort of what that is. When you're talking about Until Dawn was a phenomenal game, and you will talk about it later, I'm sure, at some point. It's a phenomenal game, but it was created by not really an indie developer. It was created by Supermassive Games, the developers of Little Big Planet, and Little Big Planet 2, and Little Big Planet 3, which were extremely popular games. These were huge, these were these money-making games.
Just to be clear, they developed downloadable content. Media Molecule was the actual developer behind the game. They did downloadable content for this game. Just fact-checking, continue.
Yeah, the point is that these are not really indie developers. I mean, yes, they are smaller than some other developers, but they've created several games before. They are not these tiny developers. And so,
are you calling Telltale Games indie? I mean, I understand that a lot of episodic games are made by indie developers, but I don't think it's fair to say that Telltale is indie. Telltale is very much a part of the mainstream now.
Well, that's probably true. But when it originally came out, I mean, I wouldn't exactly call Sam & Max or Jurassic Park really popular games or any sort of money-making games.
No, but I guess that comes to a more complicated argument in terms of what denotes indie. So I guess let's move on from this
All right.
point.
Anyway, so next point is that you said that that when an episode leaves a bad taste in your mouth, you're less likely to move on from it. And that sort of draws away from one of the other positives of episodic games, actually, which is that even if an episode is less good than the other one, so let's say that episode 2 was one that wasn't really all that good, but you played through all 5 of them. If episode 2 had a couple of sleeper moments, it doesn't really matter because the rest of the game had enough content and perhaps you played it like over the course of a week or so that really you don't really remember those bad moments as much. You remember all the good moments and you really feel that it was a positive game. And so that means that there are some poor moments in Life is Strange that you don't really follow up on as much.
There's a sense of immediacy though, where it might not be what you focus on, but it was the very last thing, thing that is immediate, the thing that is the most immediate. And you're still going to latch onto that, whereas you're not necessarily going to latch onto it as more as the good points, but it is still going to be there with the sense of immediacy, where this is the very last thing that you were left with moving forward, and moving forward. That's going to be on your mind when you look forward and say, when is this next episode coming out?
All right. What would you say to sort of the excitement that some people feel towards the next episode? I personally would not feel that. Some people say that they have this sort of feeling of excitement towards the next episode of the game.
See, and again, I think this is okay, let's talk first before I answer that. I understand where you're coming from, where these games have total branching narratives and it's never the same game when you play it twice. But I still think that it's fair to compare these to television, because what you're doing is you are creating your own narrative. A TV show presents its narrative and it's not interactive. I'm not claiming that these are TV shows. I'm claiming that they are interactive TV shows where there are multiple narratives, but you are still creating one narrative. And the way that it presents itself, the way that it is executed, the release model, all of that is still very much in lieu of a television show.
I mean, but you've previously stated that it's not that way. As a matter of fact, there's no possible way that they could release them a week apart. So no matter what, you're going to be waiting 4 to 6 weeks, which really is enough time for any of your points to be valid.
Right, but television shows, there's still a standard amount of time that is commonly accepted between episodes, whereas episodic gaming has not found that sweet spot yet. And as a matter of fact, a lot of streaming services, their original series, they don't release their episodes like Netflix and Amazon Prime. They don't release their episodes 1 week apart because they know their audience and they know the way that their audience likes to take in their content. They release their shows all at once.
But these things aren't feasible. It's not possible for a developer to do that type of
It is
a
absolutely possible, because what you do is you just wait longer to release your product, and then you release your product all at once. Yes, you don't get the immediacy of the Q&A between episodes, but it's absolutely possible to simply have a longer development period and then release your product all at once.
But what about the idea of what happens if your game isn't all that good? What happens if the lack of user feedback, the lack of QA sort of results in these huge problems on launch? I mean, look at these large games from these developers that are coming out recently with horrible game-breaking bugs that won't be fixed for 2-3 months even. I mean, these games are completely unplayable. So what happens if an indie developer releases a game on launch?
That comes from a system that has put a heavy hand, or has pulled heavily from the idea of annualization. So it's not fair to use games that are annualized as examples, just to be fair, because I'm arguing that you should have a longer development period. And games that have a lot of bugs, oftentimes like, Assassin's Creed Unity, that's not a fair comparison because that's from a franchise that is annualized and is completely going against what it is that I'm arguing for, and that's a longer development period to release a whole game.
But the The problem with the longer development period in this case is that the developers cannot do that. The episodic games allow developers to create these products and create these huge stories. They wouldn't be able to if they're not releasing them episodically.
Why wouldn't they be able to do that? Because I mean, in terms of bugs and stuff, that's why you have what's called playtesters.
It's not bugs, it's the revenue that they make from each episode. What happens if a developer is very much on its last dollar and it just finished the first episode and is saying, all right, you know what? We actually have to make 4 more. We have no money, but let's just try to make the other 4 and then release the game.
I can see that argument for smaller indie studios, but as we've established earlier, Telltale, very specifically Telltale, does not have that problem. They might have had that problem when they were smaller, when they were still using smaller licenses, such as Sam & Max, when they were using smaller licenses, but they don't have that problem now, so they don't have that excuse now. I think it would go against what they've done previously, and I don't see them ever changing, but they still don't have the excuse that they are on their last dollar and all they can feasibly make is 1 episode. If they wanted to, and again, they're never going to do this because this has been a very successful business model for them, but realistically, it is not as though they couldn't release a full game. It would be perfectly within their power to be able to release a game that is not episodic.
Yes, it is possible for them to do so, but again, for many of the reasons that I've discussed, for example, the revenue that they get, the fact that they can bug fix, the fact that they can get some type of user feedback and apply that to the rest of it, the fact that really just some games feel okay as episodes. It's the concept of watching 1 episode and then moving on to the next night. You play 2.5 hours of gameplay and then you move on. What you're stating is that really you should be allowed to move on to the next gameplay, and that's fine. For you, that's something that you would really want to do. You play for 6 hours instead of playing for 2 to 3 hours. And that's great. That's fantastic for you. But there are other people that really just want to play sort of a 2.5 hour thing, a shorter thing, and then move on after that. And that's okay too, because people have multiple play styles, because games can be played these different ways and games can be released these different ways. And this particular method really only helps the consumer, because as long as you happen to enjoy the game, or perhaps if you think that you can help fix the game, you can have the game come out and then you can choose. Do I wait for the whole thing to come out? Do I try to play the beginning now? There's this new idea of early access gaming that people really, really enjoy. People will buy these games that aren't finished at all, that are just these tiny things, and they'll say, hey, we're going to play these games, we're going to give our feedback, and that's going to be okay. Even though they're not finished, they don't have any of the features of the full release game. They're just sort of these half-finished, usually messes.
That's really interesting, because if I were to put all we've talked about into a closing argument, which we actually probably should, because it's getting to be the end of our show. I guess my closing argument is that I completely understand episodic games from a development standpoint, and think from a development standpoint, yeah, they just absolutely make sense. I know why people do this. I get why people do this, but I don't think it's fair the way that they've been, the execution specifically, and the lack of communication, I don't think has been fair to the consumers who want to be able to buy in to the series when it first comes out. But it's been unfair because the communication has been so poor and the execution has been so poor in terms of, well, when's the next episode coming out? Well, we'll tell you, but only days before it does, and until then you'll be left in silence.
Just really quickly, how do you feel about early access games?
Early access games? I mean, what you're essentially doing is you're buying into a concept.
I mean, no, you're buying into sort of the beginning of a game, and then you have no idea when the next part of it's going to come out or when they're going to add any type of new content. And usually the developers are very poor about when they tell you, and will really only usually inform you a couple days beforehand.
This is a very, very personal example. I do own 2 or 3 early access titles on Steam. The way that I was able to justify buying those personally was that, would I be okay if this was the final product? And if the answer was yes, then I bought it. If the answer was no, then I'm going to wait and see. And that's just a personal, that's my philosophy about it.
So sort of taking the early access out of early access and just sort of saying, this is essentially what I'm going to get.
Yes, because I've been jaded before by the episodic release model. So I asked myself, am I okay if this is all I'm going to get? And if the answer is yes, then yeah, I'll buy into it.
All right. I mean, for me, I see essentially no fault in episodic gaming. I understand that obviously the developers more or less are dropping the ball on this. And if they would release them in a timely fashion, more or less every single part of them would be great. But the fact that they don't, and the fact that they don't really give good schedules, if I recall, Telltale did actually give okay scheduling for the very first couple of ones that they did. I think Walking Dead, they kept reasonably close, only off by a couple of weeks each time. But overall, the developers in general have not been keeping to any sort of a regular schedule, which does make it harder on gamers. But I still say that you have a choice. You can either buy into it or you can wait till the end. And having that choice, I think, is valuable.
Yeah, and I mean, you do have a choice. No one's going to make you buy these episodic games in the order that these episodes come out. You're completely right in that, yes, there is a choice. It's just that for those of us who would rather choose to play it as they come out, those are the people who are being hurt by this model.
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay, so with our closing segment here, Matthew and I are each going to pitch a game that we are currently playing or have played that we feel as though other people should be playing. So, Matthew, what is your recommendation?
My recommendation this week is Thomas Was Alone. It's a puzzle platformer that sort of makes you actually feel emotions for shapes. There's a tiny orange rectangle that you sort of fall in love with a little bit. He's very lonely, and he finds friends along the way.
Is it Thomas?
It is Thomas, actually. And so essentially this game has a bunch of different shapes that all have different jumping abilities. They all just basically jump, but they all have personalities. There's this one shape that can jump really high, and so he's very cocky. There's another shape that can't jump very high, and so is sort of more of a curmudgeon. And then there are all sorts of other shapes that you meet along the way, some of them stranger than other ones. And you get this concept of who they are by a narrator in the background that narrates every single level and narrates what you do, and it's absolutely fantastic. So far, I've been absolutely loving this game, and it's very easy to pick up and just play, and it's short, and I can't think of very many reasons not to like it.
All right, awesome. I'm going to pitch Until Dawn, which we've talked about a little earlier, and I played a song from it. It was actually my personal game of 2015. And as we've already talked about earlier, I think it's not an episodic game, but if it were, it would be my favorite in terms of the way it just handles that model. Other than that, Until Dawn, it's a great game because it takes the idea of teenagers up in a cabin, the whole horror premise, and actually makes it scary and has pretty great execution. So with that concludes our show of the Gaming Society Radio Hour. Have a great rest of your week. This has been your host, James Goings.
And Matthew Davids.
On WMCM College Radio.
Signing off.